What is happening, you beautiful bastards? Welcome back to another week. This week, our guest is Bruce Sackman. Bruce has quite the story to tell. He's, well, Jerry, what the hell is this title? It's like 5 miles long.
This is a tough one, guys. So bear with me while I try and read this. There's no way I'd remember it. So Bruce Sackman served as the Special Agent in Charge, U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, Office of Inspector General, Criminal Investigations Division of the Northeast Field Office until May 2005.
And we found out that basically he did investigations on all medical serial killers.
Yeah, he had a special interest in the VA. I guess that was kind of, that was where the big break happened for him.
Yeah, that was his forte.
Yeah, that's where he met his first serial killer case.
But he definitely branched out from there because I guess he kind of started all of the investigations there and found the things that, you know, kind of tied all of them together. This one blew me away.
Yeah, me too, because, you know, especially with the VA, I don't think about doctors killing all their patients. But as Bruce found out, he went and investigated this first person. Lo and behold, everyone's killing everyone.
Just fucking murdering people left and right.
It's insane. Not insane enough to stop going to the doctor, as I bring up multiple times in this episode. But I was surprised just how many medical professionals just go around killing people.
All right, so before we get into this one, guys, check out the YouTube. We should be able to put up some images and whatnot so you guys can get a close look into medical serial killers. Without further ado, here's Bruce Sackman. What is happening, you beautiful bastards?
Bruce, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. What kind of exciting things have you been up to lately? Because you have been living the true crime life.
Well, I have been actually, and I've been traveling around the world speaking about this interesting and unique topic of medical professionals who murder their patients. And when I say murder their patients, I'm not talking about like a Dr. Kevorkian type.
Right.
I'm talking about people, doctors and nurses who actually murder their patients throughout the world, actually.
So not like the angel of death thing, but actually, now that we're on that for a second, as someone who spent a lot of time investigating medical murder, how do you feel about assisted suicide? Has that kind of colored your opinion?
That's different. Yeah. I actually don't have a problem with it if it's done the way I do it correctly, being that the patient, the family, the physicians, and usually in some countries, they actually have a committee of people who look at the request. So the patient's physicians and social workers and psychiatrists, and they all sort of get together, and if they honestly believe that there's nothing more that could be done for the patient, that the patient is just suffering, then I would actually support, physician-assisted suicide.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to get everyone on the same page at times. So usually you can get the patients, the doctors, and everyone else, but the family to get on that same page can be a little hairy at times.
It can be difficult, but I've actually seen it. And, you have to remember there are some people, some cancer patients and all that are just suffering terribly.
Oh, absolutely.
And just to go in and see them day after day suffer, that usually most of the family members and most of the physicians will be on board. I mean, it's a last resort, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. But so you were talking about you're seeing doctors actually murder people. Where you seeing this everywhere?
Oh, it's all over the world. I mean, you could just Google it and you could trace it all over the world. But my experience actually began at the VA when I was the special agent in charge of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. And the purpose of the Office of Inspector General is to ferret out fraud, waste, and abuse in various agencies. Like the Department of Defense will have their own Inspector General and Department of Labor, et cetera, et cetera. So I was actually in charge of the Criminal Investigation Division of the Office of Inspector General for the VA. And I covered all the VA hospitals from West Virginia to Maine. And that was a lot of work and a lot of hospitals. But I had never actually come across a physician murder until one day I got a call in my office in New York City from the chief of psychiatry at the Northport, Long Island VA Medical Center. And she said, Bruce, you're not going to believe this, but we actually have a physician working here who spent time in prison for poisoning his coworkers. Now, I didn't think that in the United States of America, you could spend time in prison for poisoning your coworkers, come out and be a physician. But I was wrong.
At the VA, no less.
At the VA, that's right. Treating our nation's heroes. I couldn't actually believe it, but it's absolutely true. And that doctor's name was Dr. Michael Swango. And that's what started my journey of 20 plus years now of locating, identifying, and investigating medical professionals who murder their patients. Now, look, the overwhelming majority of medical professionals are honest, hardworking, dedicated.
Oh, absolutely.
People. I mean, the last hospital I was working at, I saw doctors perform miracles saving lives, okay? But if you think about it, just think about this for a minute. If you're so inclined to commit a series of murders, what professions and what location do you think you might choose?
Oh, okay. I mean, you think about doctors on the whole, because so many of us have no clue what they're doing. We just openly are like, yeah, sure, give it to me, whatever. You know best. I'm putting all my trust in you. So it would be so easy to do.
That's exactly right. So if you think about it now, okay, so what profession and what location? Well, for one, you might want to choose a profession where you have the power of life and death over an individual. Now, right. What professions do we know have that power?
Okay. Yeah, only a few.
Yeah.
As doctors and politicians.
You might also want to choose a profession where you and your coworkers take an oath to save lives, to protect lives, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're working in an environment where people have dedicated themselves to saving lives, it's going to be very, very difficult for coworkers and other people to think that you're actually intent on taking lives. After all, look, the doctors have that Hippocratic oath, mm-hmm. Where they will do a patient no harm. And many nurses have a similar kind of oath referred to as a Florence Nightingale oath. So when you're working in that kind of environment where everybody has dedicated themselves to saving lives, it's going to be very, very difficult to believe that one of your coworkers who took that same oath is intentionally killing somebody.
So this first guy that you heard of, did he end up actually killing someone than
he killed about 60 people. Oh, and I want to tell you something. You know what? There's a big difference between medical serial killers and what I guess we could refer to as your traditional serial killers. Traditional serial killers, maybe they kill 6, 7 people.
Yeah.
Oh, they're amateurs. Amateurs compared to my medical serial killers. Oh, the average kills at least 30 people, I would say.
What?
Before they kill many, many patients before they're even identified, before they're even suspected of killing people because of that environment that they're working in. They're not targeting prostitutes. They're not targeting people that are jogging, at 3 o'clock in the morning, some lonely place. They're working in a hospital where everybody trusts them, where the family and the patients trust them implicitly. And, if you think about it, how many people even question, as you brought out a minute ago, what that doctor and nurse is even doing to them? Look, they just want to get better. They're in a lot of pain. I would say
it's probably like 40% don't question a thing. And then maybe another 30% might question it, but like it's just surface. And then you have another 30 that won't do anything or question everything.
Of course. And how many times have you even seen like an emergency room where the strong and assertive sort of become the meek and mild? You know, where there's like really big construction workers scared of this nurse who's coming over with this big needle.
I'd be dead because I just let the doctor do whatever. I'd be screwed.
That's what I mean.
I've been to the doctor many times, and I only questioned one thing one time. I was going in for surgery and laying in the hospital bed, waiting for them to bring me into the room. And the nurse comes over, messing with my IV bag, and I started to feel weird. And I looked over, and she had a syringe that she was slowly putting in. And I stopped her. I said, "What is that?" "We call this happy juice." And I immediately was like, I don't want any of that. I don't like how that feels. That's the only time in my life I've ever questioned a medical professional. Other than that, I'm blindly following all of them.
But see, you would have already been dead because you were already feeling it.
Doesn't that go to show you how easy it is for somebody to do something? All right. And not only that, let's say you choose a profession where there's a real shortage of people, especially during the pandemic. You know, we hear about all these nursing shortages, particularly in some parts of the country where it's very, very difficult to find doctors and nurses. So you know what? If we didn't do such a great background investigation before we hired these people, well, excuse me, you know how hard it is to find doctors here? Well, we have to go all the way to the Philippines or even to Ireland sometimes just to get nurses because we can't find them here. You know, nursing is a very tough profession. You have to be smart. You have to be strong, you know, and it's not so easy. They have a very high burnout rate. So if we didn't do such a great job when we did their background investigation, excuse me, we really just couldn't find anybody.
Well, a regular background check isn't even that deep anyways.
It's better than it used to be. I'll tell you that. I'm
sure.
Better than it used to be.
That's my other thing, though. I mean, nowadays, serial killers don't happen that often, right? Because it's too easy to get caught, right? There's too many cameras, there's too many people. But I would say the one area that you can find serial killers where it would be hardest would be in the medical field. Totally.
And look, you know what? You're working in a place where death is an everyday common occurrence. If there's a death in a hospital or a nursing home, is that going to cause an investigation? Is that going to send the police in? Of course not, because death is an everyday occurrence. And then, you know, if you've ever been on a hospital ward at, let's say, 3 o'clock in the morning, there's not that much activity going on. Maybe there's a nurse and a nurse's aide. So you work alone at night, and then you could take that curtain and put that curtain behind you and the patient, and nobody's going to really see what's going on there. And especially with these HIPAA rules, you know, cameras are very, very limited. They can only be in public places for the most part, and there's not going to really be anybody to see. It's very, very hard, almost impossible in all these cases all over the world to find a witness that actually saw a medical professional kill somebody. The best thing you could do is I saw that nurse, Bruce, you know, go into the patient's room, pull the curtain behind him and the patient, walk out, and then maybe 30 minutes later, something happened. That's about as good as it's going to get.
Don't they have to do autopsies on anyone who dies?
Autopsies. I could spend all day talking about autopsies. But let me just say this.
This is an interesting conversation starter.
Hospitals don't do autopsies anymore because nobody wants to pay for it. You know, autopsies used to be the greatest teaching tools for doctors ever. They cut it out. The insurance companies don't want to pay for it.
I thought there were certain situations where they had to do it.
No, well, if you're talking about in a hospital setting, no, there are some hospitals that don't do any autopsies at all. Really? There are some hospitals that do very limited autopsies, but you have to remember, a hospital autopsy is not the same as a forensic autopsy. You know, when you see these autopsy shows on television and they're looking for a cause of death, that's different than a hospital autopsy.
Yeah.
A hospital autopsy is more as like a confirmatory autopsy. Yeah. Could the patient have expired as a result of one or more disease processes? Yeah, he could have. Okay, case closed. All right. And you have to remember who's doing these autopsies. It's the employees of the hospital, not somebody, not an outside medical examiner.
Yeah, it's not a third party.
It's you know what? They really don't want to find something wrong. They want to be able to say that the patient expired as a result of one or more of his disease processes. And that's what all these killers consistently use as their defense in every case around the world, anywhere. Look, when I was at the VA and I had a look at patients' folders, and the VA keeps a lot of patients a long time, longer than the private hospitals. And I had a look in the patient's medical records. It was like this thick. I didn't know you could be alive and have so much wrong with you. And I have to first start to prove that the patient was murdered. You know,
yeah, good luck.
Very, very, very difficult.
So were all these cases that you found were within the VA?
Oh, no. I mean, these cases are all over the world. The good thing about the VA is the VA has an inspector general to look at this, where the private hospitals don't have any inspector general. So unless a nurse comes or a doctor comes forward and makes a presentation to the police and convinces the police that they should do an investigation, chances are nothing's going to happen. And think about this. Look, most cops do not become cops because we're good in chemistry and biology, okay?
Yep.
So it's very, very easy for us to be intimidated by the science. We don't really understand the rules. You know, this HIPAA law. Gee, what records can we get? What records can't we get? Do we need a subpoena? Do we need a court order? I don't know. I'm so confused. And who am I to challenge these physicians and nurses who are all going to say that the patient expired from their natural disease processes? Well, I have a lot of other cases. I don't know if I really have the time or the money to investigate these cases, you know?
So with that being said, why did you decide that those were the cases that you were going to go investigate? Because, you know, that sounds incredibly hard to not only prove, but even figure out if it's happening.
They are incredibly hard, but I felt an obligation to the veterans and their families to make a determination as to whether this guy, Swango, had actually murdered anyone at a VA hospital. Now, look, my dad was a World War II veteran. He spent a lot of time in the VA hospital. I understand how it is. And I felt a strong obligation just to see if this guy who had poisoned his coworkers was actually harming anyone at the VA. And I'll tell you a little bit about him, a little bit about Michael Swango. When Michael Swango was in medical school, his fellow students referred to him as 00 Swango, licensed to kill.
Oh, nice.
Because they actually felt that one of their fellow students was harming patients. It seems like every time Swango would visit a patient, something unfortunate would happen to that patient. In fact, there were even 5 suspicious deaths at the time that he was a medical student. So the students wrote a letter to the dean, and they said, "Hey, Dean, I don't think this guy Swango should be a doctor." And the dean said, "What do you know? You're only students. I'm the dean. I think he should be a doctor. You know, maybe he needs a little bit more training. We'll keep him a little bit longer. But I think he'll be a doctor." And he did become a doctor. And he graduated Southern Illinois University Medical School. And his first internship was at Ohio State University Medical Center. And at Ohio State University Medical Center, there was a young student. She was a gymnast. Her name was Cynthia Mcgee. Cynthia Mcgee got into a car accident with another student, and she was actually improving until she got a visit from Dr. Michael Swango. Then she died unexpectedly. But did Michael Swango get charged for that? No. The student that hit her with his car got charged with vehicular homicide, but he didn't kill Cynthia Mcgee.
That just makes it even worse.
Swango, that's right. Swango had killed Cynthia Mcgee. Well, at Ohio State, they said, "Wait, what's going on here? It seems like he's visiting people and something's happening, but we can't really prove it because it's so hard to prove." So Swango leaves, his internship's over, and he goes and he becomes an emergency medical technician for an ambulance company back home in Illinois. And one day he brings in donuts for his coworkers and they all get sick. And he calls them up and he says, tell me the symptoms. Tell me what's wrong. Tell me everything that happened to you. See, he wanted to relive the excitement of poisoning them twice. Well, they suspected something, but they weren't sure. Well, about 2 weeks later, he comes in with iced tea. He says, hi, guys, here's some iced tea. But these EMTs were not stupid. They took the iced tea and they had it tested and had arsenic in it. And they called the police, and the police did a great investigation. They went to his home. They found arsenic, ant poison, books on arsenic. And he was convicted and spent 5 years in jail for poisoning his coworkers.
That's all you get is 5 years for poison. How many coworkers did he poison?
I don't remember the number actually, but it was like
It had to be a decent amount.
You know what? So he got 5 years. He comes out, and being a sociopath, he is a very, very convincing person if you sit down and chat with him, as I did. And he comes out and he goes through a little name change, and he was very clever. What he did is he actually forged a whole bunch of documents showing that he had only spent 6 months in jail. He was an ex-Marine, and he only spent 6 months in jail for not for poisoning his coworkers, but he claimed that he actually was in a barroom brawl. And as a tough ex-Marine, he got sentenced to 6 months in jail, not 5 years. But the governor of the state restored his civil rights. And people bought this. They didn't do much of an investigation. They bought into it. Next thing you know, he's working at a VA hospital on the West Coast, and he meets a VA nurse, and they fall in love and they get engaged, and everything's working fine until the story comes out about him poisoning his coworkers and spending 5 years in jail. Well, his fiance obviously gets very, very upset, and they break up, and she flies back home to Virginia to be with her mom. And she says, I'm so hurt. I really love this guy. I've been getting a lot of headaches and all since all of this happened. Then one day she goes to the park, she takes out a gun, and she blows her brains out.
Oh,
well, you can't blame Swango for that, can you? Well, yes, you can, because even though the body was cremated, the family kept a lock of her hair, and we had it tested, and it was loaded with arsenic. He was even poisoning his own fiance. All right.
The guy's insane.
What year was this starting? Was this going on?
This goes back to the 80s. And then when I met him, it was in the early 90s.
Damn.
And then to make a long story short, he winds up at the in Northport, Long Island, VA. And what happened was Northport VA has a teaching arrangement with Stony Brook Medical Center out on Long Island. So he goes for an interview in Stony Brook, Long Island, and guess what field he goes? He goes for a residency in psychiatry. So that means he had to go in front of a board of trained psychiatrists and convince them that he should be in the program. And he did just that. And he winds up working at the VA. And then I got that phone call. So I hopped in the car with one of my agents, and we went down to meet him. And he was a handsome, charming, the guy looked like a movie star. He was tan, he was wearing his aviator sunglasses, cool and calm as could be. If I didn't know better, I'd want to introduce him to my daughter. I mean, if she brought home a handsome ex-Marine doctor, I go, wow, this is terrific. This is terrific. So I start chatting with him, and then I tell him what the allegations are, and he goes through that whole story about being in jail only for 6 months, the whole thing. And then I asked him for permission to search his room, and then his attitude changed completely. So he told me to leave, which I had to do. And I wanted to get a search warrant, but the U.S. attorney at the time said, you don't have enough probable cause for a search warrant because you don't have any evidence that he committed any crime out on Long Island. So he left, and he travels overseas, and he winds up in Zimbabwe, Africa. And when he's in Zimbabwe, Africa, he kills women and children, pregnant women, tempted to poison his landlady. But he has to come back to the United States to renew his passport. And when he comes back, we arrest him, but not for murder, because we didn't have any evidence that he murdered anybody at that time. For what was and still is every federal agent's favorite crime, which is lying to a federal agent. So he lied to me.
Yeah, about the prison, right?
Because he gave me that whole story about 6 months in jail and the whole bit, and he lied on his paperwork. So he got 3 years in jail for lying to me. And that gave us 3 years to do an investigation to try to find out if he had murdered anybody at the Northport VA Medical Center. Now, let me tell you something. Prior to this, I had never done a homicide case in my entire life. I spent a whole career doing hospital investigations, but they were like bribery investigations, theft of drugs, every other hospital stuff. Investigation you could think of, but never actually a murder. So how do I do this? How do I begin like this? So my boss said, Bruce, we're going to introduce you to somebody who's going to help you. And they introduced me to Dr. Michael Baden, the forensic medical examiner. He used to have a show on TV called Autopsy years ago. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
And he every time there's like a famous death or something, you'll always see him. Yeah, Michael. So he says, all right, Bruce, this is what we're going to do. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull every medical record of every patient who was at the Northport VA at the time that Swango was there. Then we are going to assemble a team. And this team is going to consist of Michael Baden, of course, as a forensic pathologist. We're going to have a toxicologist from the private sector, a firm called National Medical Services, which is the largest private forensic firm in the country. We're going to have doctors who are expert at reading charts, because they're going to be able to make a determination if, based on the records, there doesn't seem to be any apparent reason why that patient expired when they did. And also on this team, we're going to have, at that time, a relatively new profession called forensic nursing. And these are nurses that are trained in both nursing science and forensics. And they were awesome. They were fantastic. They actually gave an understanding to me of what the doctors were saying, which was many times above my head. All right, but they kind of dumbed it down for me, which was they
got to translate that language.
I really appreciate it. And so the team narrowed it down to about 5 cases where it appeared to us that the deaths should not have occurred. And, Michael Baden explained natural death to me like this. Natural death is like if you shut off a fan and the blades gradually slow down and stop. But these people, he said, it's like turning off a light bulb. They were bright one minute and dark the next. And we can't really explain why that happened. All right. So the next thing we had to do was go visit the families of the veterans. And we had to ask them this question. We would say, ma'am, sir, it's come to our attention that your dad's death at the VA may have been of a suspicious nature. Can we have your permission to go to the cemetery and exhume their body and run tests? Imagine getting a visit like that.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, it'd be a lot to handle.
Rehash the whole damn thing.
It is a lot to handle. But the families were great. They were really fantastic. Once in a while, they actually want to come and see the exhumation themselves. Other times they didn't. And when they came, we were, of course, very, very respectful. My agents used to bring flowers for the family. We always very respectful for them. So now I found myself, someone who had never done a case like this before, at a cemetery. And Michael Baden, the medical examiner, shows up, and there's the backhoe, and the backhoe comes and digs up the ground, and they put the ropes underneath, and they pull the coffin up. And the next thing you know, Michael Baden jumps into the gravesite and takes soil samples. So what's that for? He says, well, we have to test the soil to see if there's arsenic in the soil, because if there's arsenic in the soil and we find arsenic in the body, they're going to claim that it's the arsenic from the soil that creeped into the body. Wow, okay. Then we go to the local, medical examiner's office, and next thing you know, they're cutting the body open. Now, I had never seen anything like this before. It's a bit of a culture experience. Some people have a tougher time with it than others. I was okay. I don't know, some people had a tough time with it. And there I am. And next thing you know, Michael Bond's pulling out the heart, and he shows me the heart, and he says, you see, Bruce, the death certificate said they died from heart disease. There's nothing wrong with this guy's heart. And then I learned something about death certificates. I always thought that a death certificate was signed by the physician who cared for the person, and had knowledge of what the cause of death is, but it's often not that way at all. In fact, there's a fascinating story about death certificates and deaths in the borough of Staten Island in New York. This is a quick story. This is what happened. People were looking at the stats of deaths in Staten Island, and they were saying, my God, everybody in Staten Island seems to be dying from heart disease. Every death certificate seems to say myocardial infarction or some kind of heart-related ailment. What the hell's going on in Staten Island? It must be that pollution from Jersey that's coming over like poison everybody, right?
It's a stink.
Well, you know what it was? It was actually fraud. The death certificates were fraudulent. What was happening was that the funeral homes, in a rush to bury people, couldn't wait for the actual death certificates, so they were forging the death certificates, and they were putting on myocardial infarction or heart disease on every one of them. And in fact, they weren't worth the paper that it was written on. All right. So I've learned that death certificates are not like really the end all be all.
Yeah.
Okay.
We were actually just talking to a medical student who has started working in a hospital a couple episodes ago, and what he actually told us, it was the same kind of thing. He said even when the doctor is being genuine with the documentation, there's only so much that they can really even write on it if it's not something obvious like a gunshot wound. So it's even now when it's accurate, it's still a gray area.
It is gray, and but the layperson, would think that, oh, it's an accurate reflection of the cause of death, but in reality, it's more than likely not an accurate. So we went through these 5 bodies, and now Swango was about to get out of jail. Remember, for lying to me for 3 years, he's about to get out of jail, and he thinks he's going to just hop on a plane and go back to Africa and keep killing people. Well, not so fast. Not so fast, because we had made a determination that those 5 people were killed by one of 2 drugs, either epinephrine, which is adrenaline, which sped up their heart and killed them, or something called succinylcholine, which is a paralytic. In other words, if they want to put a tube down you, the hospital, they call it sucks. They would give you that, and then they would be able to put a tube down you. And we found traces of that, and there was no medical reason why there should be traces of that. But what really convinced Swango to plead guilty and save us the trial is that we said to Swango, look, if you go to trial, and even if you win, all we're going to do is put you on a plane and drop you off on the tarmac in Zimbabwe, where there's an arrest warrant for you for killing women and children in Zimbabwe.
So had they done like their own research and found out that he was doing it over there?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, you know what? That convinced him in short order that he would avoid the death penalty himself if he pled guilty. And when he pled guilty, this was an opportunity for the families to get up and talk about, dad and dad's life. And that part is very moving, because when you do the investigations, you try to stay removed from the emotion and all. But when it comes down to particularly the sentencing and the families get to speak, it is very, very, very emotional. Well, Swango was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. And the judge said something that I had never heard before. The judge said, Dr. Swango, he says, I'm sentencing you to life without the possibility of parole. But if Congress should change the law and grant parole, your parole is denied in advance. So he was not getting out any way, shape, or form. And he's in Supermax Federal Penitentiary, where the terrorists are and other super bad guys. And then he also pled guilty to killing Cynthia Mcgee. So the student that hit with his car, all charges were dropped against him. And one of the good things to come out of this case is that it radically changed the world of medical credential, because people said, wow, if we could actually hire a doctor at a VA hospital who poisoned people and there was a record of it, we have to go back and start looking at credentials. And since that time, medical credentialing has improved dramatically. Where there was maybe 1 or 2 people assigned, now they have officers assigned, and they're double and triple checking all the credentials and the background and everything. Still not impossible for some, but it's much, much, much harder for a person with a bad background to get into a hospital. Much, much harder. However, what happens when you have a pandemic? What happens when all of a sudden you can't get doctors, you can't get nurses, your emergency room is backed up, you're desperate for people?
Yeah, suddenly things get overlooked.
Things are going to get overlooked. You know, they have a lot of traveling doctors, traveling nurses who travel from hospital to hospital during the pandemic. The overwhelming majority of them, of course, are super. But this gives an opportunity for 1 or 2 bad folks that may have been caught in the credentialing process to kind of sneak in, you know, and that's something we're concerned about.
So with him, he never really had a smoking gun. It just came down to basically saying, hey, you need to admit you're guilty. There's no way out of it.
Well, I would say that the smoking gun, if we went to trial, was the toxicology, which showed that the deaths were actually consistent with epinephrine or succinylcholine poisoning. All right. And that he was the last person seen with it. So after Swango, the next case, of course, was a nurse that I had, and that nurse was Kristen Gilbert.
So when you were done with him, they basically just said, hey, we're going to put you on everyone we think who's murdering people?
It was pretty close. I mean, just when one case was ending, interestingly enough, another case surfaced, and then another case and another case. And I think what happened is people became more aware of the remote possibility that something like this can actually happen, you know, and has happened not only in the VA, of course, but throughout the country and throughout the world. The most recent case, I don't know if you saw this, was just the other day. Here's a New York Times. Texas nurses found guilty of killing 4 patients by injecting them with air.
Yeah, and I saw the headline for it.
Right, and this is just the other day. So it's not just a matter of older cases. These cases, every couple of months, there's a new case that surfaces somewhere in the world. I mean, last year, there was this incredible case about a nurse in Germany suspected of killing about 300 patients, actually proven to kill over 100 patients. And the interesting thing is, and we've had the same thing with a nurse Cullen in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, is that when the first hospital suspected something, they didn't say anything to the second hospital when that employee moved on, because they were just happy that that employee moved on. All right. Well, he's not our problem anymore. He's gone. He's not our problem. So like Nurse Cullen went from hospital to hospital to hospital. Well, the nurse in Germany did the same thing, went from hospital to hospital and hospital. But the interesting thing about Germany, and I worked with the German police on this case, and they were fantastic because they had to exhume bodies in 3 different countries. You know, I mean, because people were buried in 3 different countries. They were incredible. The German police has actually charged the managers that suspected these people
Really?
of murder and didn't say anything and allowed them to go on to the next hospital. They actually charged them with crimes. Now, they haven't been convicted yet. We'll see what happens. But that's the only instance that I'm aware of anywhere in history where the managers were actually charged with aiding and abetting these
leave it to
people
Germany.
by moving on,
Yeah.
allowing them to move on to the next hospital.
But that, I mean,
it
that's
makes sense
with
though. They should do that here.
with the first
Totally.
guy, if that woman had never brought it up that she was working with someone who had poisoned his coworkers, would you have ever caught him?
No,
You know?
probably not. Probably not. You know, and the interesting thing is that it takes usually so many deaths before suspicion even is occurred. You know, look, if somebody gets murdered, a jogger gets murdered, boom, there's an investigation.
Yeah, it's
You know?
pretty obvious.
Right. But in a hospital, if someone dies unexpectedly, they usually don't pick it up until there are multiple deaths. For instance, they come out with something like this. Every time that Nurse Bruce is on duty, the death rate goes up. Nurse Bruce takes a vacation for 2 weeks, the death rate goes down. Well, does that mean that Nurse Bruce is a serial killer? No, because maybe Bruce Nurse has the most complex cases. Maybe these people were suspected to die or whatever. But when we take a further look and we see these people weren't expected to die when they did, then things get suspicious. But how many people did Nurse Bruce actually kill before we became suspect that something happened? You know, there's a famous statement by, let me see if I could just find it here for a second, because
we got a minute. No problem.
oh, this is it. There was a medical serial killer back in the 70s. His name was Donald Harvey. All right. And this is what Donald Harvey said. This is a great quote. He says, "After I didn't get caught for the first 15 people I murdered, the first 15 people I murdered, I thought it was my right. I appointed myself judge, prosecutor, and jury. So I played God." Now, look, if you kill 15 people and nobody even questions you, is it so outrageous to think that maybe you are?
Yeah, you're gonna get
You
away
know
with
what
it.
I mean? You're killing 15 people and your coworkers don't even question it. They didn't even question it. That's why medical serial killers have gotten away with so many murders throughout the world. The number one, by the way, the number one undisputed, undefeated medical serial killer of all time so far is Dr. Harold Shipman from England. Dr. Harold Shipman killed about 300 of his patients, not in the hospital. He used to make house calls.
Yeah, I've actually heard of this guy.
Yeah. He would make house calls. And I spoke with detectives there in England, and they said to me, "Well, Bruce, he killed somebody in that house and somebody in that house, somebody in that house." Okay, and wasn't suspected at all. Wasn't suspected at all. So I think up until recently, because of some of the shows, some of the movies, you know, I hope that my book actually made a difference. People now are really starting to wake up to the possibility, as remote that it is, the possibility that someone could be intentionally harming patients. The most recent one at the VA was just last year in West Virginia. A nurse, Rita May, killed 7 patients. I mean,
So when you come across this many people that are killing this many people, have you, as an investigator or just the investigating body that takes care of all this, is there like some kind of psychological thing that they have in common?
Great question. Great question. And this is and I'm not a psychiatrist, but I could tell you what the professionals tell me. All right. There are a number of reasons, but the number one reason, and it's not for everyone, but the number one reason is something called Munchausen Syndrome by proxy. And what that is Munchausen Syndrome is you might intentionally harm yourself and go into a hospital to show, because you want to get the attention and you want people to kind of fawn all over you.
Mhm.
Well, Munchausen syndrome by proxy is when you harm somebody else and then bring them in, like a mother sometimes will intentionally harm a child.
Right.
And bring that child into the hospital and try to show the staff, oh, they're such a caring parent. Oh, help my child. Oh, do something with me, all to get attention. Right?
Mm.
Well, what these nurses and the nurse in England and a number of nurses in the United States and around the world, when you look at their evaluations, is very interesting. Because their evaluations show that they're like an average okay nurse, except when it comes to a code. That's when they excel. And we know what a code is. Somebody goes into cardiac arrest and the bells and whistles going off and the crash guard comes running in and it's very exciting.
Mm.
Well, they crave that excitement of the code because they want to show off to their coworkers what an outstanding caregiver they are, how knowledgeable they are, how wonderful they are in the code. Right? Kristen Gilbert, who was convicted of killing 3 patients, but we suspect her probably killing about 30. Doctors at the hospital would say, if I ever coded, I would want that nurse Kristen Gilbert there. She's outstanding. She takes control. She starts barking orders at the young interns who are scared shitless because they've never been through anything like this. And that's what she loved. She loved that excitement of the code. And many, many medical serial killers fall into that group, but certainly not all of them. Some just have a fascination with death. They enjoy playing God, and that's in it for them. And in very, very, very rare occasions, there's even like a profit motive, because this last Texas nurse that we talked about, he told his wife in a recorded conversation that he killed these people because he wanted them to stay as long as possible in the ICU so he can make overtime money. It's a hell of a way to make overtime, And Harold Shipman, actually, the way he got caught is he changed the will of one of his patients and made himself the beneficiary, and so the family said, what?
Another thing on the whole serial killer case, they did some research a few years ago, and I don't know if it was a CAT scan or whatever. When they scan your brain, they actually found that the whole frontal cortex has like no activity on every single serial killer. Now, you or I could have that same thing going on, but it doesn't mean we're a serial killer. But all serial killers have it, which to me is fascinating. But what it means, God knows.
They're a very interesting group. My vision of a serial killer had always been like a Charles Manson type, a guy with a crazy haircut and a swastika on his forehead.
Lost his mind.
Right. But when I met Kristen Gilbert, she was actually a kind of an attractive soccer mom, Oh, hi, Bruce. Yeah, I'll talk to you when I come back. I have to pick up my kids at the game. And when I come back, like it was just an every day occurrence. There was a nurse in Italy who, after she killed her patient, she would take a selfie with herself and the person she had just killed.
That's some balls right there.
They're a very interesting group of people, I must say. Thank God the number is relatively small compared to just the wonderful doctors and nurses out there, but it does exist. And
how many years did you end up, investigating all these people?
Well, I started Swango. I started in the late 80s, early 90s, and since that time, I've been involved in these cases throughout the world, and I've lectured throughout the world, even in the Middle East, in England, in Scotland, in Wales. It's interesting. Some countries, Italy, for some reason, has had more than their fair share of medical serial killers. Very, very interesting. And Germany has had a few. Germany actually has potentially the first coronavirus serial killer. Okay, there's a doctor there that's suspected of killing coronavirus patients. Hasn't been proven yet. Hasn't been proven because it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, I imagine.
Prove, but they're working on it, and the German police, as you can imagine, are very thorough.
Oh, I bet.
Oh, yeah.
They do everything thorough.
So they do excellent work.
Now, are you still doing it as a career, or now is it just more of a hobby that you have an interest in?
No, it's more of an interest now. You know, after I left the VA in 2005, and then I was doing internal investigations for a major healthcare network here in New York City for 15 years. And then I retired from there. And then I went to help Nassau County out with their inspector general for a while. And then I retired from that. So right now I'm just, writing and researching and doing podcasts and speaking. Now that the COVID's coming down, I can get out live again and speak. I have this huge PowerPoint and everything I do. And I speak to police, but I tell you, the most interested people are usually the nurses. I find the nurses like really the most interested audience.
Like taking notes or?
Not notes, not notes on how to do it. But you know what? After I give these presentations, inevitably, I'll be approached by a nurse or a doctor who'll say, Bruce, as I think about it, going back a while, there was this employee and we kind of suspected something, but everybody was afraid to come forward. Nobody wanted to say anything to management. In fact, there's a terrible story about what happened to 2 whistleblowers in Texas about a doctor. This is what happened. There's a place called Kermit, Texas. Kermit, Texas is in the oil basin in Texas. And you know how hard it is to find doctors for Kermit?
Yeah, I bet.
Well, we have to go all the way, the Philippines, Korea, whatever. So these 2 nurses, it's a small hospital. They were actually the entire compliance department. And they suspected this doctor of harming patients. So they go to the management and they lay it out. And the management says, well, did you actually see this doctor harm any patients? No, we didn't see him, but we know what the outcomes were. I say, well, let me ask you a question then, nurse. Is your background so perfect? I mean, if we drug tested you right now, are you going to pass or are you going to fail? Is your license and all your certificates up to snuff? I only ask you that because, if we do an investigation, then in some kind of ways, like you're under investigation.
Nice company.
So these nurses said, oh, cow, what the hell do we do now? We don't know what to do now. So one nurse said, I have an idea. Let's send an anonymous letter to the Texas State Medical Board about this doctor so they could take care of it. Well, the doctor gets wind of this, as you can imagine, and boy, is he pissed. So he calls the local sheriff, who happened to be one of his patients, and he said, hey, sheriff, I think these nurses are intentionally trying to harm my reputation and may have violated the law. And the sheriff says, don't worry, doc, I'm on the case. And he gets a search warrant for their hospital computers, and he finds that they are the authors of the anonymous letter to the state. He actually has them arrested and charged with misuse of official information, which is a felony in them part, all right? And they go to trial. And the jury's out for about 15 minutes, and they come back and they say, are you kidding me? These nurses deserve a medal for what they did. Not to be criminally prosecuted, but what kind of message does that send out?
Oh, absolutely.
To all the other potential whistleblowers out there. To say, hey, did you hear about those 2 nurses in Texas? Did you hear what happened to them? Oh, yeah, they won at the end, and they got money. But meanwhile, they got fired. Nobody else wanted to hire them. They were unemployed for the whole process. They had an arrest record.
Oh, yeah. If you're a whistleblower, get ready for a hell of a ride. And it ain't going to be fun.
Damn right. So, so nursing organizations all around the country were very supportive of these 2. But, the damage kind of was done.
Mm,
You know, when
yeah.
Kristen Gilbert, these nurses came forward and they told our office what they suspected of her, of killing people with epinephrine.
Mm.
And even after Kristen Gilbert was found guilty and got multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, their co-workers were still pissed at them for going to the cops.
Really?
They said, do you know how you harm the reputation of this hospital? Now, when people see this hospital, that's where the serial killer worked. That's where Kristen Gilbert, the serial killer, worked. They don't think about all the lives we've saved. They don't think about all the wonderful science that we've done here. They don't think about that. They only think about Kristen Gilbert killing people. And that's what you, whistleblower, did. And that's the thanks they got for coming forward with this.
Well, even after sitting here talking to you, I'm now kind of second guessing the idea of going to the hospital if I need to.
Well, listen, you know what? I wouldn't. I mean, I certainly, if you have to go, you have to go. You know, the one thing that kind of bothered me a little bit, though, and with this pandemic is, you know, the first thing, the hospitals would not allow the family members in. They said,
Right.
There's a pandemic and you can't have any family members in. Now, I've always preached that you should have an advocate when you go in the hospital.
Mhm.
Someone who politely, very underlined, politely and professionally asks and questions what's happening. What's happening with you? You know, what medications are you getting? Because if I'm a serial killer and your family is there and they're writing everything down and they're taking notes and all that, I'm not going to mess with you.
You can have that. It's just the problem is most people, unless they're older and have a dying disease, don't have it.
That's right. That's right.
You
So the
can
hospitals for a
everyone
long
can have
time
it.
weren't even letting families in during the pandemic. You could not go in. You could not go into
Or
the
can you
ward.
even go in now? I don't even know.
I think it's better now. I think
I don't
it's
even
better
know.
now. But I'm honestly not even sure. I guess it varies from hospital to hospital.
Mm.
So I'm sure that any existing serial killers were taking advantage of that.
Oh, I
But,
guarantee it.
So if we were to go to the hospital right now, is having an advocate kind of the only way we can do our best to avoid something like that?
Yeah, listen, you know, I wouldn't worry about it because
Yeah, I wouldn't either.
it's a very, very rare occasion. But I tell people, you know, it's always good to have an advocate. It's always good to show that there's somebody there watching and who cares. Because if you are intent on harming somebody, you're going to pick, and there are many patients who never get any visitors.
Mhm.
Nobody really seems to care. That was very sad at the VA, you know, that
Right.
there were some patients that just kind of lingered there without any visitors, without anybody there for them. And
Well, especially in that era.
yeah, it's
I
pretty.
imagine you had a lot of Vietnam vets that didn't have anyone there.
Right. Is that was pretty sad, you know. But look, I mean, I'm as confident as anybody when I go in a hospital, maybe just a little bit more aware than most, but it's not something that would keep me up, you know, worrying about it. But it does happen.
Yeah, I mean, so you can have a healthcare proxy, but most of the time that only comes into play when you can't make decisions yourself. So I mean, I would trust your medical professionals, but in this scenario, you would be screwed anyways. It all comes out. I mean, Bruce, throughout your years, how many of these did you come across?
Well, I've actually physically worked on 5 of them, but there have been, you know, many.
Oh, I guarantee it. But so you worked on 5 throughout the world over how many years?
Throughout the world, I would say, you know, I've seen numbers, but I'm not so far, not so sure how far they go back. But at any given time, there, you know, maybe 20 or 30 active investigations around the world, whether that results in a conviction or not, because I'm aware of a couple active investigations right now.
Now,
here-
does that
here in the
also
United
include
States.
people who are they're not good at medicine and they suck? Like they're just doing it badly?
So malpractice instead? Yeah.
Yeah, you know, and that's certainly different. That's certainly different. Look,
But is that included in the investigations, or is
No.
that a separate department?
No,
Oh, even better.
No. You know, the number 3 cause of death in the United States are medical errors.
Mhm.
Now, medical errors is not the same as intentionally murdering somebody.
So
Right,
my wife's an ER tech and she's working on becoming a nurse. And years ago, I was supposed to get a vasectomy, and she knew the guy who was going to be doing it. And the situation didn't pan out for me getting the vasectomy at the time. I had to reschedule it and blah, 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 whatever. Later, she comes to work with the guy who was supposed to be doing it. And she goes, thank God you never got it with him, because I work with him now and he has nothing but comebacks. Like every single one of his patients has an issue. And it's not like he's killing people. They literally just having issues after the fact. You know?
No, I know.
It's an interesting world.
And like I say, the overwhelming majority are just truly outstanding, dedicated people. But
absolutely.
Almost every time I give a presentation, I hear a story like that. You know, there's one doctor, we should have really said something. We should have really done something. You know, it was years ago and all that. But
I guarantee people, even outside of the medical field, almost everyone I've talked to, in whatever their career is, at some point in their life has been like, yeah, we had that guy or girl. They were just weird and something was up there and it just rubbed them wrong. Jerry and I did, we know, but like everyone's had some run into where they had someone who's just a little off.
Yeah. Yes, that's very true. That's very true.
Yeah, one that stands out for me, Grizz, is there was one guy, I didn't work with him directly, but I had interacted with him because of my career. And every time I met with this guy, I left thinking, there's something really wrong with this person. Like he acts normal, but there's something wrong here. And I couldn't ever put my finger on it. So it's not like I could say, hey, you should go check this guy out. I just tell my coworkers, I was like, there's something wrong with that guy. He's really weird. And like a year after I met him, he got arrested for massive, massive quantities of child porn.
Oh, this one. Yes.
Yeah.
Is that so the one I was right as well?
What's that? Oh no, this is actually somebody different. Child porn's a big thing now. The internet's around, but no, this is a separate incident, but that does happen a lot more common now.
So both of us happen to know a man who was convicted of pedophilia and child porn. And the day he was getting arrested, he was talking to me and I'm just thinking in my head, man, you're fucking weird. Like there's something, it's just a very odd conversation going on here. And literally that day he's arrested. And I'm just like, what?
Wow.
So it just goes to show you don't know what you're going to walk into. Not that I'm going to say people should stay out of the hospital, because if you got to go to the hospital, you got to go.
I won't ever give that message.
No. I mean, listen, the people who are in the hospitals, they have to put up with a lot of BS, and they do it fully willingly just to make you better. So they're there to help you.
Totally, that's right. Completely right.
Now, Bruce, you had mentioned a little while back here while we were talking that you had a book about this, right?
Yes. And
what is that book about? Just generally your experiences?
Well, yeah, the book is called Behind the Murder Curtain, because as I said, you pull that curtain, around you and the victim, and nobody sees. That's where the name comes from, Behind the Murder Curtain. And it's about suspicious deaths from medical serial killers at the VA. So it's VA hospitals throughout the country, and the investigations that I had conducted, of course, with help, not by myself, certainly, with a lot of help. And it's a very interesting book, and it kind of lays out how these cases surfaces, what happened to these people, and how each case was a little different than the next, and the number of victims. There's an interesting case in there about a physician that was doing medical research. And in order to get funded, he had to find a certain number of people that suffered from this particular ailment that he was doing research. So he went into veterans' medical records and he altered their medical records to show that they would meet all the requirements to get into this study, put them in their study, and they died as a result of being given these investigational drugs they should have never been given. So that's another story that's in the book.
Was he intentionally trying to kill them, or
no, he wasn't intentionally trying to kill them. He just wanted to get people in the study, and they should have never been in the study.
Man, that's fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah, it does sound interesting.
I'm gonna have to read this.
Yeah, for sure. Now, not necessarily related to murder. You came from a law enforcement background. What did you think of actually having to write a book about your experiences? Did you write that yourself?
Well, no, because I'm not I'm not a William Shakespeare by any
I'm not either.
imagination. So actually what happened was at the time I was the president of an organization called the Society of Professional Investigators. And when I was being introduced, somebody introduced me as an expert on medical serial killers. And there were actually two authors in the audience. One of them used to be an editor for the New York Post, the Daily News, and CNN. And he approached me and he said, would you like to do a book on this? And I said, sure. And that's how the book came about. So it's actually myself and two co-authors. I kind of told the story, but they actually put it in a very readable form.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah, that's a totally different skill set. So I was curious how you transitioned to that. I know that I'm not nearly a wordsmith enough to write a book about anything.
Yeah, and you know what? Even if you were, it's extraordinarily difficult to get a publishing house to publish anything if you've never published before and if you're not a celebrity. They just don't want to spend the money on you. The way my book got published is because the other two guys had published before and they had a history of successful books. If I had written the same book with the same words and brought it to a publisher, it would have never been accepted because I'm not a celebrity and I don't have that history of doing successful books. So it's kind of like, almost seems like putting the cart before the horse, but that's the way it is.
Can't remember his name now, Jackson, the guy who went to jail in China. Didn't he publish his own book because of
Chancellor Jackson? Yeah. So you can self-publish on Amazon, but it's not the same exposure that you would get.
Yeah, anybody could self-publish. That I had no interest in doing. You know, because like I said, I'm not really an author, and I had this opportunity to work with professional authors who actually put this book together and made it it's a very fast read. I mean, like in 2 nights, you'll blitz right through it, and it's a bit of an eye-opener, you'll say.
So since we're on the topic, where can we get it and tell our listeners to find it?
Yeah, you know, just on Amazon. I mean, you could go to, there's a website for the book. It's behindthemurdercurtain.com. But you could go to Amazon or any one of those sellers and you could download it electronically, or it's available in soft cover now. It's not expensive, you know, and it's a fast read, but I think you'll find it very, very interesting read.
We'll definitely have to check that out.
I think that's a pretty good place to end it. Give our listeners a lot to think about. So we really appreciate having you on the show.
Well, it's my pleasure. I enjoyed it. And through the website, if they have any questions, they could contact me directly. I'm always happy to chat with people and answer. You know, it's funny, from the website, I actually found people who knew Dr. Swango growing up. They would email me. It was very interesting. And of course, I get emails from people all over the world who suspect something happened, you know, as you could imagine.
Now, in that case, do you point them in the right direction, or do you?
I do my best. You know, it's very, very difficult depending on where they're located and what the circumstances are. And it may have just been bad medicine. It may not have been murder. You know. It may have been
I'm still blown away. Zimbabwe was going after Swango. Like, holy cow! Like, I never would have seen that coming.
Well, he didn't see it coming either.
Yeah, no. Although maybe he was just lax and said, "Screw it, I'm going to kill him however the hell I want over here. They won't look for me."
Yeah, it's truly amazing, the number of victims. Truly unbelievable.
Well, Bruce, like I said, we're going to send our listeners to find your books. They can find out more about that. And again, thanks for being on the show. We really had a great time talking to you.
It's my pleasure.
Grizz, I'm a little nervous about going to the doctor now.
You'll be fine. It's fine. After recording this, we did find out, we did some research, a couple different things. Background checks a lot better on doctors nowadays. Maybe not foolproof, but a lot better.
Yeah, versus the early 90s.
Yeah. B, nowadays, any strange death, like at all deaths that happen in a hospital are inspected by a third party that have nothing to do with the hospital, so they can't be coerced as easily to be like, oh, it's just John Smith, he kills people all the time.
That's right. So if you die because of a freak sex accident and you die in the hospital during your treatment, everyone's going to find out. So don't do that.
Yeah, it's true. So they look into it. They say,
as we said in a previous episode, make sure you tie off your dildos before you put them in your ass.
It's very important service announcement. Very.
Back to your regularly.
For some reason,
program.
they all come in saying they fell on it. I don't know why.
But back to Bruce. Bruce is he was quite a character, and man, he did a good job doing what he did.
Listen, I feel 80s and 90s, man, to be alive.
Yeah,
there had to be some scary shit time, because like that's when serial killers were at their height. Nowadays,
yeah, that's when they started
and
finding
shit.
all of them. And
Yeah,
as he said, those are just the ones that got caught.
yeah, exactly. But like, nowadays there's too many cameras and shit. But in the 80s and 90s, they were running rampant all over the place, just fucking murking people.
Well, yeah, they learned from the 70s how much you could get away with, and took full advantage the next 20 years. I'm glad that we are living in the times we're living in, despite the crazy shit going on. I'd still rather be alive today than 30 years ago in my current form. 30 years ago, I was alive, just not very effective as a human. But anyway, Chris, do your thing.
Thank you again for listening to Beautiful Bastards. New episodes every Monday. Remember to like and subscribe. Just a fly in the ointment, Hans.
You're diehard. Guys, sorry. See you next week.
It's fucking December. What else am I supposed to?